It is the winter of 1457. Snow falls quietly outside the stone walls of Pembroke Castle, but inside the silence is broken by the screams of a young girl. She is only 13 years old, and she is in labor. Her name is Margaret Beaufort. Her small body shakes with pain as midwives hurry around her, whispering prayers and trying to save her life. At her age, childbirth is almost certain to kill her. The baby is too large, her body too weak. Every cry she lets out could be her last. But this is no ordinary birth. The child struggling to be born will one day become Henry Tudor, the future Henry VII of England, the boy who will end the bloody Wars of the Roses and begin the Tudor dynasty, a dynasty that will change the course of history. On this freezing night, the fate of England depends on the survival of a child mother and the son she is fighting to bring into the world. What was at stake that night in Pembroke Castle was more than the life of one girl. It was the future of England. Margaret Beaufort was not just a child in pain. She was carrying the boy who would one day become Henry VII, the first Tudor king. If she survived, and if her son lived, the Tudor dynasty would be born. A dynasty that would give England powerful rulers like Henry VIII and Elizabeth I. But if she died, or if her child did not survive, history would have taken a very different path. The Wars of the Roses had already torn England apart. Two great families, the Yorks and the Lancasters, were locked in a brutal struggle for the crown. Henry Tudor was the last real hope for the Lancaster side. Without him, the Yorks might have ruled unchallenged. There would have been no Battle of Bosworth, no uniting of the red and white roses, and no Tudor age to shape England's future. But the risk was not only political. For Margaret, the danger was deeply personal. At 13, her body was too young for childbirth. The midwives feared she would die in labor. Even if she survived, her health might be broken forever. And they were right. This birth left her scarred and unable to have more children. The cost of bringing Henry Tudor into the world was Margaret's own body and innocence. On that freezing night, everything hung in the balance. A girl's survival, a child's life, and the destiny of a nation. Before we go deeper into Margaret's story, let me pause for a moment. If you enjoy learning about the hidden stories of history, make sure to give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps bring more of these forgotten voices back to life. And I'd love to hear from you. Tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from. I think it's incredible that we can connect across time and distance, exploring stories from the 15th century while sitting in completely different places today. It reminds me that history isn't just about kings and battles. It's about people, young girls like Margaret, who faced impossible choices and whose struggles still echo through time. Now, let's return to her journey and see how her story began long before that terrible night in 1457. Margaret Beaufort was born in May of 1443 into one of the most powerful families in England. Her father was John Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, and her mother was Margaret Beauchamp of Bletsoe. Through her father, Margaret carried the blood of John of Gaunt, the son of King Edward III. That royal blood gave her status, but it also marked her as a valuable pawn in the dangerous game of politics. In 15th century England, bloodlines could be both a blessing and a curse. Her childhood was shaped by loss almost from the start. Margaret's father died when she was just a year old. Some said he was broken by failure in France. Others whispered of poison. Whatever the truth, his death left young Margaret without a father and her mother scrambling to secure her future. As was common for noble families, Margaret's fate was decided not by her, but by the powerful adults around her. By the age of 6, she was already betrothed, promised in marriage, to John de la Pole, the son of the Duke of Suffolk. It was not a match of affection, but of politics. The union would have tied her family to another of England's great houses. But in those turbulent years, power shifted quickly. When the Duke of Suffolk fell from grace and was brutally murdered, the marriage contract meant nothing. At only 6 years old, Margaret learned her first lesson. Alliances could collapse overnight, and survival meant adapting. Her next marriage arrangement came just as swiftly. This time, she was promised to Edmund Tudor, the half-brother of King Henry VI. The Tudors were not an old royal family. They were Welsh outsiders who had risen through the king's favor. But they held something Margaret's guardians valued, a close connection to the throne. By the time she was 12, Margaret's path was set. She was married to Edmund Tudor in a ceremony that may have seemed grand but left her bewildered. Edmund was in his 20s, experienced in politics and war, while Margaret was still a child, barely out of her girlhood. She entered marriage not with choice or joy, but under the weight of duty. Her childhood ended before it had truly begun. This was the world Margaret was born into, a world where noble daughters were bargaining chips, where family names mattered more than individual lives, and where even a little girl could be tied to the fate of kingdoms. At just 12 years old, Margaret Beaufort was married to Edmund Tudor, half-brother of King Henry VI. To the adults around her, this was a clever political match. For Margaret, it was something very different. She was still a child, more used to playing in castle gardens than speaking vows of loyalty and obedience. Yet in the 15th century, noble girls did not choose their futures. Their lives were traded in marriage contracts, used to bind families together and strengthen claims to power. Edmund Tudor was in his mid-20s, a man of ambition and authority. Margaret, on the other hand, was barely able to understand what marriage truly meant. The wedding took place at her family's castle. There were fine clothes, prayers spoken, and a ceremony that promised much about alliances and bloodlines. But behind the pageantry stood a troubling reality. A child was being placed in the hands of a man twice her age, not for love, but for politics. There was no question of waiting for Margaret to grow older. The marriage was quickly consummated, and the consequences were swift. By the time she had just turned 13, Margaret was pregnant. For a girl so young, this was a terrifying and dangerous situation. Her body was not fully grown, her bones not wide enough to carry a child safely. The women around her whispered their concerns. They had seen girls die in childbirth before, and they feared the same fate for her. Margaret herself must have been overwhelmed. One moment, she was a child bride learning to navigate a household far from her family. The next, she was facing the reality of motherhood before she had even stepped into her teenage years. She carried not just the weight of a child, but the expectations of an entire dynasty. If she gave birth to a healthy son, the Tudor family's position at court would be strengthened. If she failed, the line could falter. This was the cruel reality of Margaret's world. Her childhood was over, her health placed at risk, and her future decided for her. At just 13, she was not simply a girl. She was the mother of England's uncertain future. Margaret's marriage to Edmund Tudor did not last long. In 1456, while she was still pregnant, Edmund was captured during fighting in Wales. He was imprisoned at Carmarthen Castle, where he quickly fell ill. Some said he died of plague. Others believed he was murdered. Whatever the truth, Margaret's husband was gone. She was only 13 years old, a widow, and heavily pregnant. The loss left her alone and vulnerable. She had no protector, no husband to shield her from the harsh world of politics. And yet, inside her, she carried the future of the Tudor family. Edmund's younger brother, Jasper Tudor, took her into his care and brought her to the safety of Pembroke Castle. But even its thick stone walls could not protect her from what was coming. As the winter of 1457 closed in, Margaret went into labor. The ordeal that followed was almost unbearable. Her body was far too small for childbirth. The baby inside her was large, and her hips were too narrow. The midwives feared she would die. For hours, she screamed and struggled as wave after wave of pain tore through her. The cold stone chamber filled with whispers of prayer, the smell of burning herbs, and the heavy silence of servants waiting to see if their young mistress would survive. Every push brought her closer to death. For nearly a full day, Margaret fought against agony that no child should ever endure. The midwives worked desperately, using every method they knew. Finally, at dawn, the cries of a newborn broke through the chamber. Against all odds, Margaret had given birth to a son, Henry Tudor, but the cost was terrible. The birth left her body permanently damaged. She would never bear another child. At 13, her youth had been stolen, her health shattered. Yet she had survived, and so had her son. That boy, so fragile and unexpected, would one day claim the English crown as Henry VII. For now, though, there was no glory. Only a broken girl, a newborn child, and the fragile hope that both might live through the night. Margaret survived the birth, but she was never the same again. The delivery had left her with severe injuries. At just 13, Her body had been pushed past its limits. She would never carry another child. For a noblewoman in the 15th century, that was a heavy burden. Families expected women to provide heirs, to secure dynasties through children. Margaret had only one chance, and it nearly killed her. The weeks that followed were filled with pain and weakness. Fever gripped her body, and she hovered close to death more than once. Midwives stayed at her side, feeding her broth and whispering encouragement. Slowly, she began to recover, but the scars remained. She was a girl who had walked to the edge of death and returned, scarred, changed, and far older than her years. Her relationship with her son was complicated. She loved Henry deeply, but his very presence reminded her of the suffering she had endured. Holding him may have filled her with pride, but it also carried the weight of trauma. Still, Margaret understood what others around her quickly realized. This boy was her only hope, and perhaps the only hope for the Lancastrian cause. Life did not get easier. England was sliding deeper into the Wars of the Roses, a brutal conflict between York and Lancaster. As a young widow with one fragile son, Margaret needed protection. Her family arranged for her to marry again, this time to Sir Henry Stafford. It was not a love match, but a practical one. The marriage gave her stability, but it also meant long separations from her child. For much of Henry's youth, he was raised by his uncle Jasper in Wales, while Margaret lived elsewhere. She had to watch her son grow up from a distance, writing letters, sending gifts, and praying for his safety. Margaret's body may have been broken, but her spirit hardened. Denied the chance to be a mother in the usual sense, she turned her energy towards survival, politics, and faith. What she could not give in children, she would give in determination. The girl who had nearly died in childbirth was becoming a woman who would stop at nothing to secure her son's future. As Margaret grew older, her focus narrowed to one purpose: her son's future. Henry was not just her child. He was the last real hope for the Lancastrian cause. After years of bloodshed, the Yorkist kings seemed secure, but Margaret never gave up on the idea that Henry could one day claim the throne. For most of Henry's youth, he lived far away from her, first in Wales under Jasper Tudor's protection, and later in exile across the Channel. Margaret could only see him on rare occasions. Still, she worked tirelessly from England to protect him. She wrote letters, built alliances, and used her marriages to gain influence. By the time she married her third husband, Lord Thomas Stanley, she had learned to survive in a world of constant danger. Stanley was powerful and cautious, a man who knew when to switch sides. Margaret used that connection wisely, gathering intelligence and preparing for the day when Henry might return. The opportunity came after Richard III seized the throne in 1483. Richard's rise shocked many nobles, and suspicion grew around the disappearance of the young princes in the Tower. Margaret saw this as her chance. She began secret plotting, arranging support for Henry and spreading the idea that he, not Richard, was the rightful king. These were dangerous moves. If caught, she could have been executed for treason. Yet Margaret pressed forward, convinced that her son's moment was coming. Finally, in 1485, Henry sailed from exile to Wales, ready to challenge Richard III for the crown. On the morning of the Battle of Bosworth, Margaret must have held her breath. She was not on the battlefield, but her years of planning and alliances were about to be tested. At the crucial moment, Stanley's forces turned against Richard and joined Henry. Richard III was killed in the fighting, and Henry emerged victorious. When the news reached Margaret, it was the fulfillment of everything she had endured. Her son, the child she had nearly died to bring into the world, was now King Henry VII of England. It was the triumph she had fought for all her life, and proof that her suffering had not been in vain. Margaret Beaufort lived to see her greatest dream fulfilled. Her son, Henry Tudor, crowned as Henry VII, had ended the Wars of the Roses and founded the Tudor dynasty. For England, it was the beginning of a new age. But for Margaret, the victory carried memories of the pain and sacrifice that had brought them there. She had given everything to see Henry reach the throne. Her body had been broken in childbirth at 13. Her only child had been taken from her side for much of his youth. She endured years of separation, fear, and constant political danger. Yet through it all, she never lost sight of her goal. She used her intelligence, her faith, and her determination to carve a path Through one of the most dangerous periods in English history, as king, Henry relied heavily on his mother's guidance. Margaret became one of the most powerful women in the realm. She managed estates, advised on political matters, and built schools and colleges that still stand today. Yet she never remarried after Stanley's death, devoting herself entirely to God and to her son's reign. In a world that often dismissed women as powerless, she proved that influence did not always come through armies or titles, but through resilience and vision. When Margaret died in 1509, just months after the death of Henry VII, she left behind a kingdom transformed. Her grandson, Henry VIII, would take the throne and carry the Tudor name into history. Elizabeth I, her great-granddaughter, would become one of the most famous monarchs England had ever known. None of it would have been possible without Margaret. Her legacy is one of endurance. She was a girl forced into marriage, a child who nearly died in childbirth, and a mother who sacrificed everything. Yet she rose above those hardships to shape the future of a nation. Margaret Beaufort's story reminds us that behind the crowns and battles of history are human lives, and sometimes the fate of a kingdom rests on the courage of a 13-year-old girl.